Bhagavate Vasudevaya Shri Ganeshaya Namaha Shri Saraswate Namaha Vakratunda Mahakaya Surya Koti Samaprabha Nirvignam Kuru Me Deva Shubhakaryeshu Sarvadha Saraswati Namastubhyam Parade Kamarupini Vidyarambham Karishyami Siddhir Bhavatu Me Sada Krishnaya Vasudevaya Hare Paramatmane Pranatakleshanasaya Govindaya Namo Namaha Gurur Brahma Gurur Vishnu Gurur Devo Maheshwara Gurur Sakshat Parabrahma Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Guru Charana Kamalibhyo Namaha Satakshi Goseva Ka Sansthapak Acharya Nandakishore Guru Madan Mohan Guru and Ghanshyam Guru Pranam Radhe Radhe Parivar. My name is Diksha Dahal and I'm from California, US. Thank you for hosting and preparing this program and doing service through Goshala. By the grace of Guruji and my parents, I have had access to religious education and want to share my knowledge today about the Gita. Gita is dharma. The introductory shlok starts with the word dharma. Dharma chitre guru chitre samaveta yuyutsavaha mamaka pandavascheva kima kurvata sanjaya. While the last shlok ends with mama. Yatra Yogeshwara Krishno Yatra Partho Dhanurdharaha Tatra Shri Vijayo Bhutir Dhruva Nitir Matir Mama, symbolizing how the text encapsulates dharma and its teachings. There are a total of 18 chapters and 700 shloks, which explain the path to moksha or liberation from samsara, without having to practice an entirely renunciatory lifestyle. One can build their own path to liberation using the tactics of dharma, provided to raise their karma and escape the cycle of rebirth. There are three main sections: Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga. The first 6 chapters focus on Karma Yoga. Chapters 7 through 12 focus on Bhakti Yoga, and 13 through 18 focus on Jnana Yoga. The Gita is also the summary of all of the Upanishads and occurred when war seemed inevitable. There was no other option. The Gita is one of the most powerful resources in the world because it gives the answers to the doubts one holds. It helps one navigate their life with devotion and understanding. The Gita is dialogue between Lord Krishna and his disciple Arjun, who has doubts about fighting the war and choosing his path in life. I will be running through summaries of important values and takeaways from each chapter. Chapter 1, Arjun's Despair. The story begins with the battle lines drawn between the armies of the warring cousins, the Kauravas and the Pandavas. Arjun is one of the 5 sons of Pandu. The Pandavas are upholding dharma, which is the right way of ruling a kingdom, while their cousins are using deceit and other forms of treachery to maintain power. The Pandavas have done everything possible to negotiate fairly, but their evil cousin Duryodhan still continues to hold the throne illegally. It rightfully belonged to the Pandavas. Therefore, to uphold dharma, war was inevitable. But Arjun, upon facing the reality of killing his cousins and family friends, throws up his hands in despair. He has Krishna drive his chariot out into the middle of the field between the 2 armies, and he laments to Krishna that he cannot go through with this. Arjun represents all seekers. Even Arjun, raised as a prince, educated, renowned, and accomplished, is subject to sorrow and confusion. Chapter 2. Arjuna's Inquiry. Krishna feels Arjuna's pain and suffering, but calls him out for whimpering like a child. Arjuna, taken aback by this, explains his dilemma more concisely and finally asks Krishna to help him with this seemingly unresolvable inner conflict. Sisyaste hum, I am your student. In Sutra 2-11, the Krishna begins his teaching and the Gita officially commences. Chapter 2 is the most important of all, as it contains the essence of the whole teaching. It begins with the immutability of Atma, which is beyond birth and death. If only one were to master this, success would arrive. From Sutras 55-72, Krishna describes stable wisdom, the living embodiment of an awakened one, a wise one who knows the truth of wholeness. All the knowledge that is needed for enlightenment is presented. Understanding the nature of desire is the key. Chapter 3, on the nature of action. Karma. Arjun recognizes that he wants total freedom, moksha, enlightenment, nothing less. And yet, Krishna has told him to go and join the battle. Within India, there is a strong tradition of sannyasa, a life renouncing worldly possessions and responsibilities to pursue knowledge. Sometimes this comes after raising a family, but it can come at any time in one's life. Arjuna tells Krishna that he wants to become a sannyasi to gain knowledge. He does not want to fight. Krishna then goes on to explain the nature of action or karma and describes what karma yoga is. Much of the Vedic tradition revolves around rituals and pujas, ceremonial actions and prayers. Krishna explains that action does not require a doer, that there is a separate egoic self that thinks he or she or they is acting. The belief in this separate self is the source of suffering, leading to endless harmful actions in the world. The teaching returns to studying the nature of desire, of likes and dislikes, not to try to eliminate them, which is simply another desire, but to see them for what they are and not be held prisoner by them. Chapter 4, Karma Yoga, the renunciation of action through knowledge. Krishna begins by explaining the history of the teaching, how it originated with Ishvar, and has been handed down from teacher to student over a multitude of generations. An avatar is the absolute divinity manifesting in the human body. Like Krishna, who appears on the planet when dharma has been disturbed to reawaken the timeless knowledge. Krishna has a human form, but is also timeless wisdom. Birth and death are just transitory phenomena, and as such, he is beyond action. As we will see in the last 6 chapters, this is the truth of all beings. We just don't know it yet. To be truly free, one has to recognize that their own nature is free of all action, unbounded by time and space. Krishna now goes into all levels of reality. There is an empirical reality, such as the sun, the the moon, the stars, the birds, bees, flowers, trees, etc. But ultimately, both are then there is a subjective reality, the projections we create in our mind from our experience. But ultimately, both are expressions of wholeness, a single reality, or Brahma. Of interest to yogis, Krishna introduces the Gunas, the three qualities of energy, specifically here relating to the types of human minds. Again, we see parallels to Patanjali. Krishna explains to Arjun that one acts in the world from knowledge, from wisdom, one is free. One does not have to drop out of the world or renounce. That is the false self that believes it is acting. You have to live the life that is currently unfolding. Chapter 5, Renunciation, or Sannyasa Yoga. Arjun still has his doubts. He still believes that renunciation is the key to liberation. Moksha. Krishna has praised both Karma Yoga and Sannyasa Yoga. So Arjun asks, which is better? Both lead to liberation, but these paths represent two very different lifestyles. Krishna explains that sannyasa, although it may look an easier and a faster path, it is actually much more difficult because there is a certain depth of understanding that one already requires to become a sannyasi. It is not for beginners. Karma Yoga actually prepares one for sannyasa, but it is not a particular practice like pranayam. It is your whole life, moment by moment. In Sutra 5 through 20, Krishna uses the term sthir buddhi, one whose knowledge is unshakable. Variations on the Sanskrit root stha, which stands for stable, steady, appear all through the Gita and the Yoga Sutras. In Sutra 1 through 3, Patanjali says, Tada drashtuhu svarupa avasthanam. Then one's self-knowledge, the recognition of the true nature, the svarup, or the self, remains stable. We find in the Gita an 18-chapter elaboration on this sutra. At the end of chapter 5, Krishna introduces dhyana, meditation, as a way to develop stability in the mind. This will be the topic of chapter 6. Chapter 6 on meditation, or dhyan. In Patanjali's first chapter, he distinguishes between two types of meditation. Samadhi. The first is with a seed or form, sabija samadhi, to sustain the mind and weaken the tendencies of the mind to wander into troublesome waters. The second is letting the mind rest in the infinite, nirbija, or seedless samadhi. This latter is the meditation Krishna presents to Arjun. It is resting in grace. If liberation is giving up action, the sense that I am a doer that requires giving up the urge to follow desires, but you cannot give those up unless you already know that you are whole. So how do you break the cycle? One aspect of meditation is the process of noticing habits and tendencies that disturb the peace of mind. We have been hypnotized by our own confusion, and we have to dehypnotize ourselves. A disciplined approach has to be undertaken to overcome the confusion. Krishna describes sitting meditation in a quiet, clean, and uncluttered place to purify the mind. He again uses the term sthira and sthita to indicate a sense of unwavering steadiness. Thus, the yogi becomes free from sorrow. Chapters 7 through 12 focus on the Parameshvara, or the creator and the creation being one, Brahma. Chapter 7, Jnana, Vijnana Yoga, which is the complete knowledge of Brahma. Here, jnana signifies an indirect knowledge, as differentiated from direct knowledge, Vijnana, implying that Krishna is revealing the truth of himself, not some other kind of truth. It is immediate, absolute, no questions left, no doubts lingering. Krishna tells Arjun that this type of knowledge is rare in the world. Very few seek it at this level, and of the ones who do, still fewer come to full realization. This is not to scare Arjun, but to intrigue him. Krishna introduces the term Prakruti, but uses the term in a slightly different way from Patanjali. Krishna calls the manifest universe Apara Prakriti, the world of form, the elements, etc. Para Prakriti is the unchanging source or primordial cause of the Apara Prakriti. In the Yoga Sutras, Purusha is the unchanging, unmanifest Para Prakriti. But, as the sutras are primarily dualistic, is said to be separate from Prakriti in moksha. In Vedanta, there is wholeness, not duality. Next comes the nature of causation, how the universe comes into being. Krishna says, I am the cause of the entire creation and its ultimate dissolution. This takes some explanation, teasing apart the unchanging from the transient forms that come and go, and yet seeing that they are not different or separate, but just different orders of reality. Krishna recognizes that it is easy to get lost in the world of form, or Maya, and lose the unchanging infinite source, and offers devotion as a way to find the divine in the ordinary. Chapter 8, Askara Brahma Yoga, Limitless Brahman. At the end of chapter 7, Krishna introduces the word Brahma and describes how a wise man, even at the time of death, recognizes ultimate truth. Arjun begins chapter 8 by asking about Brahma and what happens at death. Krishna returns to contemplation on Parameshwar and adds the chanting of Om to realize Brahma. A discussion of nature, the celestial realms, lokas, and cosmic timescales, yugas, and the cycles of birth and death help Arjun distinguish between the world of change and the unchanging Brahma. Death does not grant moksha. Only knowledge can do that. Prayers and rituals alone cannot grant moksha, even though they are desirable. Brahma Vidya, or the direct knowledge of Brahma, is what brings freedom or moksha. This chapter is compared to the Upanishads, whose subject matter is also the Brahma Vidya. Chapter 9, the king of all knowledge, the king of secrets. In the previous chapter, Krishna mentions the Brahma Loka, but wants to clarify that getting to heaven is not moksha. Only through knowledge, or Brahma Vidya, which Krishna has been unfolding through since chapter 2, is this possible. But there are many ways to become lost in the world of time and space, of body, mind, ritual, and desire. The knowledge is said to be secret because even if you hear the teachings, it is rarely understood. Also, it is not arrived at by the normal means of acquiring knowledge, such as perception or inference. Rather, Brahma Vidya is only gained through total commitment, compassion, faith, grace, and devotion. That is when success is near. A mature mind is needed for spiritual knowledge, and these virtues, when cultivated, lead to maturity. Chapter 10, the glories of Bhagwan. Everything is Bhagwan. The divinity and the name used for Krishna throughout the Gita. Bhagwan means one who has bhaga, the 6 aspects of fullness, or the 6 absolute virtues. They are all riches, all strength, all fame, all beauty, all knowledge, and all renunciations. All pursuits are ultimately the pursuit of Bhagwan, Atma, or Brahma. Bhagwan is not only all forms, all manifestations, all creations, but also the source, the creator, who remains unmoved, ahimsa, amidst the impermanence. Chapter 11, the vision of the cosmic force. At the end of chapter 10, Krishna states that pervading the entire universe with one pada, or foot, I remain. Arjun wants to see Krishna as the entire universe. Of course, Arjun thinks that this can happen through some sort of magic trick or special, explosion, or at least he thinks he does. Seeing the cosmic form requires knowledge, and that knowledge is not available to the physical eye. Therefore, Krishna gives Arjun a special eye, so that he may see the fullness of Bhagwan. Arjun's hair strands on end as he sees into Bhagwan. He sees into infinity, endless forms, blazing suns, countless arms, mouths, devas, devils, saints, and sadhus, heaven and hell. All the warriors, including Arjun, allies and enemies, are seen being consumed. Ishvar is not only the creator, but also the destroyer. Arjun expresses his fear as well as his awe. He offers his salutations, his apologies for not seeing, and he asks, "Please return to your original form." Krishna returns to his human form, and Arjun relaxes. In the final verse, Krishna again articulates the path of Karma Yoga to Arjun. Chapter 12, Bhakti, or devotion. The word bhakti comes from the root bhaj, meaning service. Dedicated action to Ishvar, who is in the form of dharma, is called bhakti. The question arises because Arjun is still confused about the difference between sannyasa and karma. He wants knowledge, but is called to duty, to go to war, to defend the dharma of the citizens. He still thinks that sannyasa is superior as a means of self-knowledge. Krishna explains that it is the attitude with which one goes about his daily activities that leads to self-knowledge. This attitude is devotion or bhakti. Chapter 13 through 18 focus on the jiva being Ishvara. Chapter 13, the nature of the knower and the known. What is the nature of Purusha and Prakruti, the knower and the known? Other terms that carry the same meaning have been used, and Arjuna has some confusion. So he also asks about the Chitra or Prakruti. Chitra Jnana and Jnana, both Purushas, the means of knowing, we find a very similar discussion within the Yoga Sutras. But Krishna begins by discussing Chitra and Chitra Jnana, because those words do not have the connotations imposed upon Purusha and Prakruti by the Sankhyas. Krishna also discusses Jnana, especially in relation to the values and attitudes of a mind that is mature and ready for knowledge, or Brahmavidya. Chapter 14, the division of the three gunas. What are the gunas? How do they bind one? How can one be released from them? As is Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, the understanding of the nature of the gunas is fundamental in liberation. Krishna describes the coming into being of creation, the known universe, the birth of Prakruti and the gunas. Vedanta, however, does not consider Prakruti, the material cause, the substance, to be separate or independent from Purusha, the unchanging source. In Vedanta, the word Brahma describes the eternal, unchanging presence who, in the form of Maya, appears as Ishvar, the totality of creation in all of its dynamism and wisdom. Gunas appear and disappear. Brahma alone remains. Atma is Brahma. Jiva is Brahma. This is Brahmavidya, seeing the truth of self. Chapter 15. Everything is the self. Sarvatma. Included within this chapter are the tree of samsara, the nature of the jiva, which is the individual being, the subtle body and reincarnation, the need for maturity, the all-illuminating light, perishable and the imperishable. Detachment is listed as the key to seeing through the disillusion of samsara. That the I is limited and inadequate. Chapter 16. Favorable and unfavorable dispositions. What is the mindset that naturally moves one towards spiritual inquiry? And what is the opposite mindset? Indian literature is full of stories of battles between the Devas and the Asuras, representing the inner conflict in the human mind between good and evil. In chapter 16, Krishna uses Devas and Asuras to highlight qualities to aspire as well as qualities to avoid. Spiritual wealth, the wealth of the Devas, accumulates as one nurtures certain values, and those values need to be understood, not just mindlessly followed. Krishna lists 26 of these in the opening verses, some to be repeated again in chapter 17. Then, Krishna lists the qualities of someone born to the wealth of the Asuras. These include hypocrisy with reference to dharma, pride, harshness, the tendency to demand respect, and pretentiousness. He lists desire, anger, and greed as the trinity to give up. He then explains how behaviors arise out of these qualities and how to cultivate the positive ones by following the teachings of the Vedas, or the Dharma Shastras. Chapter 17. Threefold Shraddha. From chapter 16, Arjuna wants to know why people are drawn to behave the way they do. Krishna uses the term Shraddha to help explain. Shraddha is more than faith, but includes an element of devotion, of dharma, or prayer. It doesn't translate easily into English, but it is the key word in chapter 17. The threefold element refers to tamas, rajas, and sattva. In respect to the human mind, what is the shraddha of one with a tamasic temperament, a rajasic temperament, a sattvic temperament? What types of foods do they eat? What types of rituals do they perform? These questions and more, Krishna answers Arjun, who asks about the performance of Vedic rituals. He wants to know if they are part of the Yoga Shastras, the path of awakening. Krishna goes on to explain the moral and ethical imperatives of devotion, like the yamas and niyamas of the sutras. Included are ahimsa, nonviolence, socha, cleanliness, straightforwardness or arjava, brahmacharya, which is the restraint in all actions, yaktapas, or the wise use of words, mana prashadha, mental cheerfulness, maunam, not talking unnecessarily, dana, generosity, and finally, Krishna explains Om Tat Sat, the threefold expression of Brahma. Chapter 18. This Om Moksha and Sannyasa. This is the longest chapter, 78 verses, and Krishna's teaching ends with a restatement of the first teaching verse. Giving up all karmas, take refuge in me alone. I will release you from all karma. Do not grieve. Patanjali's Yoga Sutra also gives Ishvar Pranidhana, which is surrender to the Ishvar, the divinity. A major role on overcoming the impediments to drashtu svarupe avasthanam, resting in the true nature of the self. The definition of yoga. Essentially, this chapter summarizes all the major teachings within the Vedas. The fundamental teachings of the Gita involve karma, sannyasa, and moksha. The path of karma, or karma yoga, is being in the world, accomplishing what needs to be accomplished, keeping with dharma, performed with bhakti, not to acquire results, but for liberation, moksha. Sannyasa is living a life outside of the normal worldly demands, solely in pursuit of knowledge to attain moksha. As Krishna repeats again and again, both are valid pursuits for gaining liberation, enlightenment, freedom from suffering, or however else we might describe knowledge of the true self. Another way of describing the teachings is twofold: Brahma Vidya and Yoga Shastras. Brahma Vidya is direct knowledge of the self. Atma is Brahma. Yoga Shastra refers to the preparatory practices and actions that prepare the seeker for Brahma Vidya. And with that, I'm going to conclude. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my knowledge to the best of my ability on this obviously complicated, enormous, grand text. I appreciate you joining me during this global pandemic, and I hope I intrigued your curiosity and willingness to read the Bhagwat Gita on your own and seek liberation within your life. May God bless everyone. Radhe Radhe.